the epiphanies that I had in relationship to his work is that I always knew that there was something wrong with the idea that poverty caused crime. Right. It's just a stupid idea, because there's lots of societies where the material level of comfort is vanishingly low, but that are perfectly functional. You know, like the pre-European contact Inuit were a good example of that. I mean, what did they own, man? They had snow and animal fat, and that was about it. You know, and so absolute level of privation is not an enticement to criminality. And as Nietzsche pointed out, you know, even dreadful life circumstances is no inevitable inducement to criminality, because you can interpret those dreadful circumstances in multiple ways, one of which is, I'm not going to continue promoting such things. Instead of, you know, if you're bullied, you can easily learn not to be a bully. And most people do, because otherwise the world would be nothing but bullies in about 3 generations, right? Because you'd get exponential increase in the prevalence of something that spread. It would instantly, everybody would be a bully, and that isn't what happens, so it gets dampened down. But what Daly really crystallized for me was the notion that it was economic inequality that was driving this behavior. Now, having said that, I've really been pulled in 2 directions about the ethical, what would you call it, the ethical ramifications of that discovery in 2 ways. One, we don't know what psychological factors mediate the relationship between inequality and homicide. Now, we do know that it mostly characterizes young men, mostly between the ages of 15 and about 26 or 27. And that it seems to have something to do with sexual competition. I buy that. But the mere fact that that's the case doesn't justify it. Like, it could be, the causal pathway could be perceived inequality, resentment and hatred among the more disagreeable and emotionally unstable subset of males in that unequal state, justification for violent behavior, right? In which case, you can't draw a straight causal pathway from the inequality to the homicide. And that the treatment could easily be, stop being miserable and jealous and go out and do something useful. Now, I'm not saying that that's the proper interpretation from an ethical perspective of the data, but it's a perfectly plausible interpretation. And so I think that one of the things that Daly does, and I was kind of disappointed in his last book in the last half because of this, is that he jumps from his data to the prescriptive notion that it's redistribution in a somewhat socialist manner that would best redress that. And the thing is, I would like to believe that, but I don't believe it. And I don't believe, or at least I'm skeptical of it for a variety of reasons. One is, well, we don't know how to redistribute. It's a big problem. And like, I've also watched people at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy suddenly come across money. And generally, it's a bloody catastrophe. It doesn't help them at all. You know, especially
lottery winners, right?
Well, that's a great example. But I mean, if you're dealing with people who are even in worse straits, like maybe they have an alcohol and cocaine problem, it's like, well, they're great as long as they're flat broke. But man, you give those guys money and you're lucky if they're not dead in a month. Right. You know, so merely providing people with money isn't as useful as socialists think. That's the problem with money, and that many of the problems that are associated with what the socialists consider poverty aren't problems of lack of money at all. So, and here's things the socialists do not like to take into consideration. And I would also say this is true of conservatives, by the way. Okay, first of all, there's a radically tight association between poverty and low IQ. And that doesn't mean every poor person is stupid, you know, to speak bluntly, but it does mean
you just brought 100,000 new haters to your
exactly.
email.
Well, exactly.
Good luck, Dr. Peterson.
Exactly. But the notion that if you're not intelligent, you're more likely to be poor is so self-evident that only someone who's willfully blind can deny it. Or arrogant, you know, and I see this in the professoriate who says, well, there's no evidence for IQ or for the biological foundation of IQ. So says the privileged person with an IQ biologically determined of 130 and above, who is sitting in his or her position precisely because of that radically unequal initial distribution of cognitive capacity. So I just think that's so. What do? Attribute it to their own moral virtue? I mean, what kind of bloody argument is that? Conscientiousness matters, but even that seems to be heritable to a reasonable degree. Right. So there is no attempt to address the role of intelligence. Because look, God, here's something, man. This is mind-boggling. It's absolutely mind-boggling. It is illegal in the United States to induct anyone into the armed forces who has an IQ of less than 83. Okay, now here's why, and this is really worth thinking about. So, the U.S. Armed Forces has been doing intelligence research since like the beginning of the 20th century, really more than 100 years. And they've done a lot of the fundamental studies. And they were interested. And they were interested partly because, well, they wanted to actually select intelligent people for the officer corps, good. But more importantly, as the social policies developed, in peacetime in particular, the armed forces in the U.S. has been used as a mechanism to move people from the chronic dispossessed underclass, let's say, up into at least the working class and maybe into the middle class. So it's an organization that can produce social mobility. And so they've been really interested in trying to find competent people in the dispossessed classes who have the intellectual capacity to rise up a few levels in the socioeconomic hierarchy, which, by the way, was also the reason that IQ tests were introduced and used in the UK. They were left-wing tools, not right-wing tools, just so everyone is clear about that. They were there to try to find the deserving, lower-class, uneducated who could benefit from higher cognitive training. And they worked, too. So anyways, the armed forces has been studying this like mad for a long time. And we need to point out that their motivations are precisely aligned, weirdly enough, with those of the more admirable socialist types, because they really do want to pull people out of the dispossessed class and move them up the economic hierarchy. There's no downside to that. All right, so what have they discovered? Well, they discovered painfully, after 100 years of contemplating it and trying to do everything possible to avoid the conclusion that if you had an IQ of 83 or less, there was not a single thing that you could possibly be trained to do in the armed forces, no matter what it was, that wasn't positively counterproductive. Now, 83, that's about 12% of the population. Now, you really got to think about that. That's 1 person in 8 who isn't sufficiently intellectually capable of performing the lowest end tasks in the military. Now, the military is complicated and it's becoming more and more complicated, so I'm not putting down the military. But what I am doing is noting that if that's true for the military, which has a huge range of possible disciplines and occupations, it's also true for standard society. And that means that 1 in 8 people in our society is now sufficiently intellectually impaired so that there is absolutely no place for them in the workforce. And redistribution of income is not going to help that. And that's just the surface. There's low IQ, even though average IQs are raising. But Jesus, man, if you can't run a computer now and you need to be pretty damn literate to do that, there's almost nothing you can do. And all the really low level stuff, like, in Toronto, there are guys who drive these little carts on the sidewalk to pick up garbage. Now, you could train someone with a lower IQ to use a stick with a point on the end of it to clean up garbage. And I'm not being a smartass about this. I've worked with low IQ people. I know how they struggle. I've had direct experience with them. And I know how much training it takes to get them to do even relatively simple tasks. Okay, so we talked about IQ, and that knocks out about 10% of the population. And that's a lot of people. Okay, then there's unconscientious people, right? So maybe we take the people who are 1 in 20 low in conscientiousness. Okay, so that makes them not very well suited for rote jobs because you have to be reliable in a rote job, and definitely not suitable for things like managerial positions. Now, if you're extroverted and open and low in conscientiousness, maybe you can pursue a career as a stand-up comedian or an entertainer, something like that. That's an erratic lifestyle, but still functional, But for standard jobs, low conscientiousness knocks you out. Then there's the top 5th percentile of people who are high in neuroticism. They can't tolerate stress. So they're going to come down with depression and anxiety disorders if you stress them at all. And those are independent dimensions. So that means we've got 5% on the neuroticism distribution, 5% on the conscientiousness distribution, and 10% on the IQ distribution. That means we've got 20% of the population who are going to struggle like mad, no matter what you do. And mere income redistribution is not going to help that. So I also understand that the inequality issue is a problem for social stability, because if inequality reaches its theoretical maximum, which it does when the winner takes all, then the rich end up in gated communities, which is a dismal and wretched way to live. And the entire society destabilizes because the murder rates start to climb up, and there's calls for revolution, and people turn to criminality as an alternative means of making money. It's a catastrophe. But the truth of the matter is that the classic political solutions to that, like simple economic redistribution, aren't sufficiently sophisticated to actually address the issue. So, like, I noticed this, for example. Here's an example of this. When I used to live in Alberta, I lived there at the height of the oil boom, and a lot of my young friends, because I was young at that point, 16, 17, quit school, went off and worked in the oil rigs, and they were making like 70, 80 grand a year back in the late 70s. So they had more money than they knew what to do with. Okay, so what did they do with the money? Well, that was easy. They bought cars and wrecked them, and they went to the bars on the weekends when they came out of the oil rigs, for their 4 or 5 day break, and they spent like $1,000 a night till their money was almost completely blown. And 5 years later, the vast majority of them had absolutely nothing to show for it. Now, if you want to make money where oil is booming, what you do is go open a bar, because that's where all the money ends up. And so...
Or a brothel.
Well, or a brothel, that's right, or a strip joint or something like that. That's exactly right. That's where the money aggregates. But the socialist, part of the socialist issue, and I also think you could lay this at the feet of conservatives, capitalists, is that we think that money solves way more problems than it actually solves. And some of these damn problems are so intractable that there is no obvious way of solving them with money. I can give you an example with IQ. The Americans went to war on poverty in the 1960s, and they put the Head Start program into operation, right? And everyone was hoping for the Head Start program, man. Like, the socialists were hoping for it because it would raise the bottom and give everyone equality of opportunity. And the conservatives were hoping for it because, well, Jesus, if you could get the underperforming lower class educated and more productive, like, great. Who the hell is going to be against that? And I spent a lot of time scouring the Head Start literature, really, for like 10 years, because I wanted to understand it, because it was one of the most optimistic social programs that was ever produced in Western society. And here's the results. If you put kids in Head Start, say when they were 3 approximately, they leapt ahead of their peers, even cognitively. So they did better in school in grade 1 and grade 2 and grade 3. But by grade 4 and 5, all of their peers caught up. All of them. So they got an initial boost, but it didn't magnify the way it was hoped. Because you might think, you give kids an initial cognitive boost, and what that happens is that it increases exponentially across time, and they stay ahead, or even get farther ahead. Did not happen. Now, the Head Start kids were more likely to graduate. They were less likely to have teenage pregnancy, and they were less likely to be incarcerated. So it wasn't an abject failure, but the point was to improve cognitive function, which it did not do. It was an absolute failure at improving cognitive function. And that's a complete catastrophe. But it also shows you just exactly how intractable the problem is, because that was as good a program as a bureaucracy could implement. Now, it had flaws. Like, I calculated at one point how much additional adult attention the typical Head Start kid would get in a year from an adult. And the answer was virtually none, because imagine that it's only about 2 hours a day. There's about 10 kids per adult, so then that's 2 hours divided by 10. Most of them are 3-year-olds, and so you don't spend most of your time interacting with 3-year-olds teaching them. You spend most of your time feeding them snacks and taking them to the bathroom and making sure they don't fight and taking off their winter clothes and all of that. And they also used Head Start as an employment program, so the people who were teaching the young kids weren't necessarily very qualified. So you could say that they really didn't receive any additional adult attention. But even that cynical view doesn't point in the direction of doing it better, because what are you going to do? Put them one-on-one with a trained adult? You know how bloody expensive that's going to be? It's just not going to happen. It's way too prohibitively expensive. So back to Martin Daly.
Yeah.
Yes,
well, that was a big parenthesis. That was a 20-minute parenthesis.
Inequality is a problem, and it's a social destabilizing problem, and even Republicans and conservatives should be concerned about that, because it does destabilize society and it does increase the crime rate. But that doesn't mean we know what to do about it. We don't know what to do about it. And I don't think that we're willing to address the problem seriously, because we won't look at the actual causes of either poverty or relative inequality. We're too afraid to.